The first time HOA Karen marched up to my front gate and demanded my code, while waving a clipboard like it was a royal decree, I realized I had made the best decision of my life, when I programmed my security system to automatically alert the sheriff after 3 wrong attempts, and she was already pulling out her phone before I could even explain how badly this could go for her, because she was convinced that since her house was within eyesight of my land, she had some cosmic authority over my driveway and privacy. And the look on her face when I said this property is not under the HOA and never will be was a pure mix of confusion, fury, and desperation that made me feel like I was about to witness a live performance of someone's ego collapsing in slow motion, and the way she leaned in like a hungry vulture made it clear she had been waiting for a moment like this just to feel powerful again. So I told her calmly that the wrong code alerts the sheriff instantly, and that is when she smirked as if she had just unlocked the secret weapon of neighborhood righteousness, and she jabbed a finger toward the keypad like she owned the soil beneath it, and said, "I do not care, I will get in there one way or another," because in her mind gate control meant life control, and she couldn't handle that I had something she couldn't touch, which made this whole situation more dangerous, entertaining, and ridiculous than I anticipated. And as she stood there, with the sun reflecting off her oversized sunglasses and the wind tossing her wild haircut into a tangled crown of entitlement, I knew this woman was going to be a long-term problem, louder and more dramatic than anything my fancy alarm system could ever warn me about, because she wasn't here for safety, she wasn't here for community, she was here to conquer. And her first attempt at the keypad sounded like a tiny beep that echoed like a starter pistol to a battle she thought she could win, but the system blinked red, immediately forcing her to step back like she had just stepped on a snake, and she tried to make that step look casual only to hit her heel on a rock and wobble like a penguin in a windstorm. So I stood still watching this entire display unfold while pretending to sip my iced tea, even though inside my chest my heart was thumping from the thrill of watching Karma warm up its engines as she tried a second random code, this one clearly typed with the arrogance of someone who believed the world should rearrange itself to fit her imagination. And again the keypad mocked her with another red flash, and now her face twisted into an expression usually reserved for realizing you have spinach in your teeth at a job interview, and she hissed something about rules and power, making me wonder if she practiced HOA speeches in front of her bathroom mirror while clutching a laminated copy of the bylaws. Then she wiped the sweat from her forehead, muttering that this time she had the right code because she had memorized the gate pattern from the last owner, who apparently gave her access since she was on the board when the neighborhood was being developed. But what she did not know was that last owner sold me the land specifically to escape her and the homeowners association circus she built like a throne room. And she pressed the keypad a third time, and an immediate alarm tone buzzed out like a bee swarm waking up, and the security camera rotated toward her blinking blue, which meant one thing: the sheriff had been alerted. And I swear I saw the panic knock her confidence off the cliff of her ego all in one blink, but her pride glued her feet in place as she awkwardly pretended nothing was wrong and tried to open a conversation about community safety and shared responsibility, while I calmly reminded her she just called law enforcement on herself, which made her voice break into awkward pitches like she was trying to sing while swallowing sand. Her phone buzzed and she glanced down at the screen, turning pale before forcing a smile so unnatural that even the squirrels watching from the oak tree looked uncomfortable, and she asked what exactly happens next, and I said the sheriff usually arrives within 10 minutes depending on how many wrong tries he sees in the system logs. And the way her eyes widened made me wonder if she had warrants or was banned from the county fair for fighting someone at the lemonade stand. But before she could formulate whatever excuse she had cooking in her imagination, the distant siren began echoing from the main road, and she spun around sharply, yelping something like I was just checking the system functionality, because I am responsible for ensuring compliance in this community. But her voice cracked in the middle, making it sound more like a guilty confession recorded accidentally, and as she shuffled toward her house with fake dignity, her sandals snapped, sending her into a ridiculous hopping escape while I stood there sipping the last bit of my drink, trying not to Laughed too loud because I knew this was only chapter 1 of what would become a beautifully chaotic rivalry rooted in her obsession with control and her inability to accept that someone might legally exist outside the reach of her clipboard tyranny, and when the sheriff truck rolled up and asked me what happened, I simply pointed to the camera, which now displayed a perfect cinematic view of Karen limping up her driveway, and he chuckled, shaking his head, saying not her again, before assuring me he would stop over and have a nice little chat with her. And as he drove off, my phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer friend, who had helped me finalize the property paperwork months ago, and the message read, "Did she try the gate yet?" followed by 3 laughing emojis, which told me everyone except Karen already knew how this chapter would start, and absolutely no one could predict how much worse it was about to get when she realized that every attempt to break through my gate would only build a stronger case against her and trap her deeper in the quicksand of her own power hunger. And the breeze carried a single thought through my mind that felt like the beginning of a thrilling plot. I was not under the HOA, but the HOA was about to be very much under me, because I had not only bought a house, I had inherited a war, and the first shot had just been fired by a woman whose greatest weakness was believing she could never lose. The sheriff must have given Karen a lecture that rattled her bones, because the very next morning she marched back toward my gate with the posture of someone who had spent the entire night Googling property law and watching motivational videos titled, "How to Dominate Your Neighborhood Using Bylaws and Sheer Will," and she arrived holding a folder so thick it looked like she had printed every HOA document since the dawn of civilization, while wearing a bright sash that said Community Oversight, which I had never seen before, and I suspected she had crafted it in the middle of the night using leftover craft paper, and pure delusion, because there was no universe where her authority extended past my fence line. But she was determined to convince herself that it did anyway, and she cleared her throat with the importance of a judge announcing sentence as I approached holding my morning coffee, and she claimed that according to a community mandate she was entitled to know the gate code for emergency access and shared infrastructure safeguarding, even though the road leading to my gate was not shared or HOA controlled, which she would have known if she read the land map instead of scribbling threats on colorful sticky notes. But she kept tapping her folder like it contained divine commandments, and she launched into a dramatic monologue about neighborhood harmony and compliance, all while conveniently skipping over the fact that she had caused a sheriff response last night and practically sprinted away from the scene like a guilty raccoon fleeing a trash can. She tipped over, so I told her calmly that this gate was on private land and that she had no right to demand anything. Then I added that if she entered any wrong code again, the sheriff would be notified and arrive faster, now that there was a record of suspicious attempts, which made her swallow hard, and her eyes did that thing where the pupils shrink like a camera lens on a suspense scene. Yet she readjusted her fake sash and tried switching tactics by pretending she wanted to be friendly and asked if we could discuss compromises over tea, but the way she said compromises sounded like a trap with sprinkles on top, so I politely declined, while trying not to laugh at the fact that she kept angling herself to block the security camera from getting a full view of her face, as if that would prevent the system from recognizing her, which only made her look guiltier and more unhinged as she performed a weird half-dance between the gate and the hedges. So I told her she could step fully into the frame so the security system would not flag her, but she took that as an insult and declared that she had every right to stand anywhere she pleased because she represented law and order within this community. And then she waved her folder like it was a weapon powerful enough to crack open the gate itself, and flicked open a page of bylaws and started reciting random rules, completely unrelated to my property, like trampolines must be spring-anchored and holiday decorations may only be displayed during designated periods, and no lawn ornaments depicting political animals, which made me wonder what kind of circus chaos she had been policing before I arrived. And I took another slow sip of my coffee, waiting for her to realize none of this applied to my land, but the longer she recited the more flustered she became, until finally she pointed her finger straight at my chest and declared that she would call for a full HOA board evaluation of my non-compliance, and this whole area would be placed under review because she believed a technicality must exist somewhere that gave her sovereignty over every stone and leaf in sight, and before I could respond she spun around dramatically and stomped away, but she did not go quietly. She shouted that I would regret disrespecting her authority, and that she would come back with reinforcement, which made me imagine an army of middle-aged clipboard-wielding neighbors waddling in formation behind her, chanting bylaws like a battle hymn, and as she reached her driveway I noticed a sleek black car approaching the neighborhood entrance, and slowing down near Karen as a sharply dressed man stepped out carrying what looked like a leather briefcase. She immediately perked up with a giant victory smile, because she probably assumed this man was some city authority she had summoned through her HOA hotline, but the man walked past her without a single glance and headed straight toward me, holding out his hand, politely introducing himself as my attorney friend, who had come to finalize a couple last papers and check how the new security installation worked. And Karen froze mid-brag with her mouth stuck open like a paused cartoon character as he explained loudly that this entire road and gate were protected under deed restrictions that excluded HOA control, and then he added that the sheriff department had placed a watch notice on wrong access attempts so future incidents would count toward harassment, which caused Karen to let out a small squeak that sounded like a balloon losing air because suddenly everything she believed she controlled slipped through her fingers, and my lawyer kept going explaining that I actually owned the land past the creek, including the only legal access path that led to the HOA clubhouse, meaning if things ever escalated legally I could technically restrict road access entirely if certain boundaries were violated, which felt like a nuke casually placed on a breakfast table because Karen looked like she had just been told the son was being repossessed, and her world started spinning while she clung to her folder like a life jacket in a hurricane. But before she could recover, my lawyer mentioned that he would be filing documents that officially notified the HOA that they had no authority on my property, and any attempt to enforce policy here would be a breach of property rights. And then he looked directly at Karen and said, "You really should stop using the keypad since the sheriff may escalate responses next time," and that single sentence shattered whatever battle armor she thought she had because she staggered backward speechless and nearly tripped again, only catching herself by grabbing her mailbox, which creaked under her grip, and my lawyer gave me a wink, then walked inside, leaving me alone with Karen, who suddenly had no voice, only rage in her eyes and trembling panic in her hands as she hugged her folder to her chest like she needed something familiar to keep from collapsing. But she still tried to salvage her pride by yelling that she was not finished, not by a long shot, and that the HOA board would hear of this betrayal of community values. But the desperation under her words exposed how scared she was, because everything she relied on for power was slipping, and she could feel it. And as she stormed off, this time stomping harder than before, I watched her go with a strange mix of amusement and anticipation, because for the first time she realized the battle she picked was not just a little gate code argument, it was a war she had already begun losing, and the real twists had not even started yet. Karen returned 2 days later, but this time she did not come alone because apparently she had called for reinforcements like she was assembling a tiny but determined army of clipboard warriors, and when I heard footsteps and distant loud complaining voices heading toward my gate, I braced myself with my morning coffee ready for whatever ridiculous theater she was bringing next, and sure enough I watched as 3 HOA board members followed behind her like ducklings trailing a furious mother duck, all clutching rule binders and wearing matching polo shirts that screamed "We take power way too seriously," and Karen stood proudly at the front of her squad pointing toward my gate like she was presenting an enemy fortress that needed conquering immediately, while introducing each board member with unnecessary enthusiasm as if they were elite agents of justice instead of neighbors who probably just wanted an excuse to gossip and feel important for once. And she dramatically declared that a formal Inspection needed to be conducted on my property to ensure there were no unapproved structures or hidden violations that could threaten the neighborhood aesthetic, whatever that meant, since my land sat outside their boundaries. But logic had never been her strongest weapon, so she held up a stack of papers and said the board had voted to extend HOA authority down this road due to emergency oversight needs, and everyone deserved security patrol access and shared maintenance rights. And I took another sip of coffee, letting her finish her speech, because interrupting would have only fueled the wildfire of her delusion, and once she paused, waiting for applause or fear or surrender, I simply smiled and calmly reminded them that the HOA had absolutely zero jurisdiction here, that this was private property with recorded deed protection, and that approaching my gate demanding compliance could now be considered trespassing, harassment, or both. And the board members looked at each other like they had walked into a room expecting cupcakes but found a court summons instead, and one of them, a short man with a permanently confused facial expression, asked Karen quietly if she double-checked the documents, but she waved him off, insisting that I was just bluffing, because people like me always bluff in the beginning, she said with a triumphant smirk that immediately weakened when she noticed the blinking security camera pointed right at her, recording everything again, and she asked if I planned to keep spying on them like some paranoid criminal, while standing inches away from a giant camera lens installed specifically for security, which was hilarious that she believed she had the right to question my protection against her. But instead of arguing, I told her the system automatically logs the presence of unauthorized personnel near the keypad, and if anyone attempts the code wrongly again, the sheriff would be notified faster than last time. And her face twitched like she had been reminded of a trauma she hoped to forget, and the board members stepped back slightly, as if proximity could get them arrested by association. But Karen puffed up her chest, refusing to let fear win, and she pointed her finger furiously at the keypad, yelling that she would file a major complaint about my lack of compliance, and she demanded once again that I provide my gate code or remove the gate entirely, since she believed it blocked a vital community access path. And my laughter nearly escaped, but I kept a straight face and asked her politely what access she was referring to, considering the fact that this road led only to my house and nowhere else of community importance. And she opened her mouth, then shut it and opened it again like a confused goldfish who lost its script, while her board members awkwardly coughed into their sleeves, trying to avoid eye contact because they could see her narrative collapsing. Yet she doubled down, insisting that my gate caused safety concerns because emergency responders might one day need entry, and I told her nicely that emergency services already had remote access through my Sheriff Link security system, and that any attempt by unauthorized individuals to tamper with the gate was exactly why the system was necessary in the first place. And she snapped that she would escalate to legal enforcement, and I told her confidently that the sheriff had already warned her, and any more keypad attempts would result in a trespass case filed officially. And I could see sweat forming at her hairline as she imagined another sheriff visit, but then she decided to be bold in the most reckless way possible by reaching for the keypad again, claiming it was her right to verify code reliability and perform a safety check. And I watched in slow motion as her finger tapped a button and the keypad let out its first angry beep, turning bright red, and she froze so hard even the wind seemed to pause in confusion, and the board members panicked, one of them yelling, "What did you do?" while she shakily insisted it was a routine inspection. And she tried another random number, then another beep, louder, angrier, more dangerous now, and I swear I could hear the sheriff's system transmitting instantly with a soft chirping tone that signaled help was on its way, like a superhero, but only for homeowners trying to escape HOA tyranny. And the board members looked ready to run, but Karen held her ground, with pride melting off her face as she pretended she knew what she was doing, until that third inevitable beep screamed across the quiet street, and the camera light flashed blue, which was the sheriff alert color, and the look she gave me was a desperate plea for some magical reverse button to undo the disaster she just caused. But no such button existed, not for her, not today, not ever. And the silence that followed was the kind that makes you question every life choice that led to the present moment, until that silence broke with the distant but rapidly approaching siren that signaled the arrival of her worst nightmare wearing a badge, and Karen blurted out excuses faster than her brain could filter them, claiming she was only testing the system for everyone's safety and that I was manipulating the security technology to entrap innocent citizens, which made the board members collectively facepalm, but they did not have time to scold her because the sheriff's truck appeared from behind the trees, tires crunching gravel like a soundtrack to justice, and Karen tried to position herself as the victim before the sheriff even stepped out, whispering to her board allies to support her story, but their eyes said nope, we are not going down with you. And when the sheriff got out, he saw the camera footage feed displaying on my phone, which I held up casually, showing Karen pressing buttons like a toddler trying to guess a computer password, and he sighed that exhausted law enforcement sigh reserved for repeat offenders, and said, "Ma'am, we talked about this," and Karen stuttered, claiming she slipped and accidentally activated the keypad 3 different times while giving an inspection speech at full volume, and the sheriff looked at her like he was contemplating whether ridiculousness could legally count as a crime, while I stood quietly sipping my coffee watching Karma wrap its loving arms around this moment and squeeze tight, and the board members slowly backed away, promising to review their interpretation of property boundaries before disappearing like embarrassed ghosts, leaving Karen stranded, alone to face the consequences. And as the sheriff gave her a final warning logging her actions into an official report, she turned her glare toward me full of fury, humiliation, and panic, all swirling into one unstable storm, and she hissed that this was far from over, that she would not be defeated by a stubborn landowner with fancy alarms, and soon the HOA would take action in ways I could not imagine. And as she limped away, once again sandal bending awkwardly under her frustration, I knew she was not bluffing, she was gearing up for something bigger, something messier, and the real chaos had only just begun. I thought after the sheriff reprimanded her twice, Karen would back off and maybe spend some time reflecting on her life choices, or at least find a new hobby that did not involve trespassing, but no, she returned with a new level of determination and a sinister gleam in her eyes that told me she had spent the last few nights crafting the next phase of her master plan, while barely sleeping, fueled entirely by pettiness, caffeine, and the belief that she was the chosen enforcer of the neighborhood. And what arrived with her was so absurd that at first I genuinely thought it was a prank, because she came marching down the road towing behind her a portable generator and a bright orange angle grinder, like she had raided a hardware store and chosen tools specifically designed to make my day interesting, and she yanked off her sunglasses with a dramatic flourish, declaring that if I refused to give her the gate code, then she would simply remove the gate itself, because in her mind boundaries only existed if she permitted them to exist, and the board members must have refused to join her this time since she was alone, but that only made her more dangerous, because a desperate Karen without witnesses is a Karen without brakes, and she rolled the generator into place, fumbling with the pull cord while muttering a chaotic mix of threats and motivational quotes she probably found on HOA Facebook groups, and when the engine coughed to life, she smiled with the pride of a villain who finally gets her hands on the doomsday device she has been craving, and I decided this was the moment to step outside, holding my phone with the camera recording everything, because if she wanted to create a spectacle, then I would gladly collect receipts. And she revved up the grinder, sending a shower of sparks into the air as she pressed it against the steel of my gate, but all it did was screech loudly and shave off a tiny sliver of paint, which only further enraged her, because she yelled that this was industrial steel and would require more power, and I kindly reminded her that tampering with a security gate connected to law enforcement systems was a felony which could lead to an immediate arrest, but she insisted that she was doing a community service performing unauthorized security upgrades, because she believed criminals might one day try to use this gate to hide behind, which made absolutely no sense, but she was too deep in her own logic to care what reality thought. And then it happened. The grinder slipped out of her grip, bounced off the bar, and flung backward into the dirt, causing her to shriek and flail like a confused chicken as she struggled to turn off the generator, while also trying not to fall on her face and the moment she stopped swearing and dusted herself off, she tried a new tactic by marching toward the keypad with renewed hope and reaching for the buttons again, and I shouted not the keypad, but she was already jabbing numbers in a random lightning-fast pattern like a toddler, smashing a piano hoping it produces Beethoven, and the keypad screamed out its first angry beep, causing her to freeze, but her pride shoved her forward again, and she entered another guess, then another beep, and she threw a panicked look over her shoulder at me, as if begging to know whether she should run or double down, and she chose the worst possible option, and jabbed the keypad a third time, activating the sheriff alert, now louder and more urgent than the previous incidents, and the camera rotated and flashed blue, and she dropped her grinder and yelled, "Why does everything I do summon the sheriff?" like she was shocked that consequences existed in this universe, and she grabbed her generator cord and attempted to run away, dragging it behind her, but the wheels caught a rock, and the thing toppled over, skidding on the pavement, while she nearly face-planted trying to yank it upright, which only made the scene funnier and more chaotic as she scrambled, like she was escaping a bear, except the bear was the law and she was the honey, and the sirens appeared much quicker this time because the sheriff likely recognized the location and thought not again, and when the patrol car stopped, one deputy stepped out rubbing his temples as if mentally preparing for another episode of the Karen Chronicles, and she immediately began a frantic speech about how I had weaponized technology against innocent homeowners and she was the one trying to stop potential dangers, but the deputy calmly asked why she was operating power tools near a private security installation without permission, and she blinked, rapidly searching her brain for a lie that could survive more than 3 seconds before collapsing, and she finally muttered she was doing maintenance oversight, and the deputy turned to me asking if she had permission, which of course I said no, and then he asked if I wanted to press charges, which caused Karen to gasp so loud birds flew from a nearby tree, because until that moment she had not realized that idiotic persistence could actually land her in real legal trouble, and I looked at her trembling, trying to stand tall but failing miserably, and I told the deputy I would not file a complaint today as long as she left immediately and stayed away from the gate for good, and she nodded so quickly I thought her neck might snap, and she began dragging her generator in the most pitiful slow retreat, whining under her breath that this was not fair and I would pay for this betrayal of community order. But she could barely breathe from the effort, so it just sounded like a dying squirrel trying to threaten a bulldozer, and the sheriff left after reminding her there would be no next warning, which she pretended to ignore, but her shaking hands betrayed the truth, that she was terrified of pushing things any further, yet deep down I knew she would anyway, because she was addicted to control and hated that she could not control me, and just when I thought the comedy was over, my phone buzzed with a message from my lawyer friend saying she really tried power tools ? And I laughed, because no one could believe the lengths she was going, and later that evening I heard rustling near the fence, so I checked the security feed, expecting Karen lurking in the shadows, but instead I saw 2 HOA board members whispering urgently outside her house while she paced back and forth waving papers like she was giving a war speech, and one board member looked terrified like he knew they were dealing with a grenade that was already missing the pin, and I realized she was not backing down, she was escalating, planning something bigger, something coordinated, and I leaned back in my chair feeling that adrenaline rush again, because as absurd as this was, it was also a battle she was destined to lose, and the next move would bring consequences far more serious than a siren call, because she was about to drag the entire HOA into a fight they were legally guaranteed to regret, and I smiled, thinking if she wants war I can serve it with a nice cold glass of reality and extra paperwork. The next morning I woke up thinking maybe Karen finally ran out of steam, or maybe the HOA board staged an intervention and convinced her to take a long vacation somewhere without gates or power tools, but when I stepped outside with my coffee I noticed a small crowd gathering at the end of my private road, complete with lawn chairs, binoculars, and even a cooler, like they were settling in to watch a championship match, except the sport was absurd neighborhood drama and their champion was none other Then Karen, who appeared shortly after wearing a blazer and carrying a megaphone, which immediately signaled that peace was not on her agenda, because a megaphone never brings peace, it brings speeches, threats, and the type of chaos only a self-appointed ruler can create, and she strutted into view with the confidence of someone who believed her moment of triumph had arrived as she yelled through the megaphone that the HOA emergency meeting was now in session and everyone needed to witness justice being restored to the community, though justice in her dictionary probably translated to give me your gate code or I will shriek louder, and she waved a pile of documents labeled emergency access petition as if she had uncovered a golden legal loophole that would grant her the authority she craved, and the onlookers murmured like they were watching a soap opera live and unscripted, and Karen pointed straight at me, accusing me of isolating myself from the community, endangering everyone by restricting access to important safety pathways, even though this road only led to my home, the woods, and a pond full of confused ducks who wanted no part in HOA politics, but logic was merely background noise in her mission, so she stepped closer with her megaphone ready to blast her next proclamation when the sheriff's deputy pulled up again, and at this point the poor man looked like he had aged 10 years in the last week, because every call he got from this neighborhood involved the same culprit and the same drama, and as he approached, Karen tried to intercept him, explaining loudly that she was conducting an official vote to override my gate, but the deputy asked who authorized the vote, and she said the community did, and he asked which community, and she gestured vaguely around like the concept of community could be summoned from thin air, while the crowd awkwardly looked away, pretending they had not come just to watch her meltdown unfold. And the deputy sighed, turning to me, asking if she had permission to hold a meeting on my private road, and I reminded him again that this area was not HOA property, and everyone present was technically trespassing, which caused several spectators to suddenly discover a pressing need to be anywhere else as they hurried back to their homes, sipping their drinks like nothing happened, and Karen shrieked inappropriate use of private authority, which earned confused stares because she literally just tried to take control over private land, and the deputy told her she either moved her gathering to actual HOA territory or she would be cited for organizing unlawful obstruction, and she reluctantly dragged her lawn chair militia back a few feet to the HOA boundary, but she kept using the megaphone to continue her rant about rogue property owners who think they are above the rules, and how this attack on their community values must be met with strength and immediate action, and at that point I expected her to start chanting slogans and passing out pitchforks because the dramatics were escalating faster than a soap opera villain discovering they lost custody of the yacht, and after the crowd finally dispersed, Karen glared at me one last time and stomped toward her house, muttering into her megaphone at low volume, which made everything she said sound like the voice of a haunted duck, and I thought maybe that was the climax of her meltdown, but just a couple of hours later I heard loud knocking at my door, not the gate, the door, meaning she somehow got around without setting off alarms, and when I opened it she was standing there without the megaphone but with a mischievous smile like she had found a brand new strategy, one that terrified me more than the grinder, and she began speaking softly in a voice so sugary it could rot teeth instantly, saying she had a friendly offer for me and wanted to resolve this dispute peacefully if only I would listen to reason, and she held out a single sheet of paper which I took reluctantly, expecting some laughably illegal order, but instead it was a printed purchase offer. She wanted to buy the strip of land that included my gate road and right-of-way, claiming it would allow community unity and harmony, and she offered an amount so low it could not cover a month of maintenance, and before I could even respond she said she was sure I would not pass up such a generous deal, but if I refused, well, then things could get messy, because the HOA had many tools at its disposal, and those tools did not include angle grinders, but they were sharper and more dangerous, and she smiled like a fox who believed it had cornered a sheep, only I was not the sheep in this scenario, so I told her calmly that not only was I not selling but her attempt at coercion could be documented and added to the harassment record, which caused her polite mask to crack instantly as she snatched back the paper, ripping it in half and hissing that I would regret choosing the wrong side, and then she stormed off again, leaving me at the door wondering what her next desperate move would look like, and I did not have to wait long, because that evening as the sun set I heard barking and shouting near the gate, and when I looked at the feed my jaw dropped because Karen had brought a hired security guard wearing a cheap uniform and carrying a flashlight like he was auditioning for the role of authority figure number 3 in a budget action movie, and she was pointing at my gate, explaining some twisted scenario about community patrol jurisdiction and demanding he take control of the gate area, and the guard looked confused because even he knew this smelled like nonsense, and he refused to trespass, which made Karen lose her mind, and she started screaming that nobody respected HOA enforcement anymore, and I guess she needed someone to blame, so she pointed directly at my camera and yelled that if the HOA could not enforce the rules then she would become the rule, and for the first time there was something in her voice that was not just annoyance or entitlement but real desperation, the kind of desperation that grows when someone's entire identity depends on control, and that control is slipping like sand through their fingers. She ran back home again, this time, not screaming, not stomping, but pacing with frantic energy as she plotted her next move, and I realized the storm ahead would be bigger than anything she had tried so far, because she was done playing small games, and she was ready to strike in a way that would drag this battle beyond gates, and now I had to prepare, because she was not just after a code anymore, she was after power, revenge, and validation, and that combination can ignite problems far larger than a siren and a sheriff report, and as I stood there watching the night settle over the gate, I knew her next attack would not be loud, it would be calculated, and I would have to be ready for whatever nightmare she unleashed next. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my doorbell ringing non-stop like someone was stuck in an elevator panic button mode, and when I opened the door I found a stack of envelopes dumped on my welcome mat so tall it looked like a miniature skyscraper made entirely of HOA rage, and each envelope was stamped with urgent violation notice or community enforcement action, and my name was spelled wrong on every single one, which honestly made the whole attempt feel even more pathetic, but inside each letter was a fake fine for ridiculous made-up violations like unauthorized gate existence and excessive privacy and refusal to provide emotional comfort to HOA officers, and there was even one accusing me of allowing wild animals to roam freely, which I assume referred to either the deer in my woods or the ducks in the pond, but since neither of them pay HOA dues I guess they were considered illegal infiltrators now, and I stood there flipping through these papers thinking Karen had reached a point where she was manufacturing imaginary crimes faster than a toddler inventing rules during a board game, and before I could even bring the stack inside I heard footsteps, and saw her staring from across the street like some villain waiting to see her trap spring, but when she realized I was laughing instead of panicking she stomped back toward the HOA office, which was really just a rented room in the clubhouse decorated with posters that said, "Community First," which was ironic considering Karen's definition of community excluded anyone she could not boss around, but she did not retreat for long because later that afternoon the real escalation began when a sleek SUV pulled onto the road bearing a giant magnetic decal that said HOA Legal Compliance Division, and a man in a suit stepped out carrying a clipboard with a smug expression like he had come to seize the crown jewels, and Karen followed him like a proud war general explaining that I was a dangerous rule dodger who had corrupted the neighborhood justice system and endangered all family values, which made me wonder if she was mixing up HOA arguments with a superhero movie plot, and the man cleared his throat introducing himself as the HOA attorney, which was hilarious because I had done my research and knew the HOA did not employ its own attorney, they only outsourced when they actually had a legal situation, so either he was lying or Karen paid him out of pocket, which meant she had officially weaponized her wallet in this feud. And he started with a speech about property harmony and mandatory compliance for community infrastructure, and I let him finish because his dramatic pauses deserved at least that much courtesy. Then I calmly explained that the HOA had zero legal authority here, and any attempt to enforce rules on my land would result in trespassing claims and civil damages, and my lawyer had already filed documents to notify the county, which made the attorney's confident smile wobble like a chair missing a leg, and Karen noticed his hesitation and immediately threw a fit, yelling that he was supposed to fix this problem for her, and how dare he show weakness in front of the enemy, and he whispered something about legality and restrictions, and she snapped back, "Legality is what we say it is," which was a sentence that perfectly summarized the HOA dictatorship she believed she ran, and when he tried to walk back to his SUV she blocked his path, insisting he continue, but he politely pushed past her and drove off, leaving her alone with anger so thick it seemed to form steam above her head, and she stared at me with the dark determination of someone who just lost a major battle but decided the war was not over, not even close. That night everything got quiet, too quiet, which was unusual because Karen usually made noise until her mission felt validated, so I checked the security camera footage from time to time expecting to catch her sneaking around with tools or a new minion, but nothing happened until around midnight when the sensors detected motion near the back of my property, a place Karen had never bothered to explore before, and the infrared feed showed her creeping around with a flashlight and a shovel like she was searching for buried treasure, except the treasure she wanted was probably evidence she could twist into a violation report, so I activated the speaker system and spoke calmly through the outdoor speakers telling her she was trespassing and the sheriff would be notified, and she screamed, dropping her shovel and flashlight before sprinting away, as if the trees themselves had yelled at her, and I thought that scare would finally snap her back to sanity, but instead the next day she showed up at my gate looking exhausted, unstable, and oddly triumphant, because she announced that she had found a loophole in county zoning records, and she could get my gate removed under emergency public access claims, and she waved some poorly highlighted documents like she had just uncovered the Constitution, but I recognized the paper immediately. They were outdated drafts, never approved and legally worthless, and I told her that, which made her deflate like a popped bounce house, but then she grabbed her megaphone and shouted that she did not care because she had decided that, if the law could not help her, she would bring the media, and the power of public embarrassment would break me, and within an hour local news vans started arriving, blocking the road, reporters stepping out with cameras and microphones while Karen strutted around pretending to be their heroic source, telling them a story about a rogue homeowner building a gated fortress to keep families unsafe and cutting off rescue routes, and one reporter asked if the rescues she referred to had ever been blocked, and she stuttered and changed the subject to community values, which even the reporter seemed too polite to point out was not an actual answer, and they turned to me asking for my side, and I explained calmly that my property was legally separate from the HOA, the gate had been approved, and the sheriff had full access for emergencies, and that the only person threatening safety was the woman repeatedly triggering law enforcement alerts while attempting to break into private property, and the crowd murmured as the narrative flipped in real time, and Karen tried to regain control, yelling lies, forcing tears, squeezing them out like someone shaking an empty ketchup bottle, hoping a drop would fall, but the reporters were already noticing the security footage displayed on my phone showing her trespassing and using a grinder and triggering alarms, and suddenly her hero act collapsed like a cardboard prop caught in the rain, because now she looked like the danger, not me, and as the cameras focused on her meltdown she shoved the megaphone into a bush and screamed that the entire world had turned against her, and that she would not stop until everyone regretted doubting her, and she stormed off while the reporters filmed her dramatic exit, making her the viral villain she never wanted to become, and as the news crews packed up, the deputy arrived once more, tired but now amused, telling me that Karen had officially crossed into charges waiting territory if I ever wanted to press them, and as I watched Karen's windows slam shut I knew she was wounded, and chaos would now come not from her public tantrums but from her private desperation, and the scariest version of Karen was now waking up inside her, fueled by humiliation and the fear of losing control entirely, and she would strike back soon. I could feel it like thunder building beneath silent dark clouds. The news report was supposed to be her moment of victory, but instead it became the spark that burned down her throne, because by the next morning everyone in the neighborhood had seen the broadcast showing Karen trespassing, cutting into my gate, and setting off sheriff alerts like she was auditioning to be the worst villain in a home security commercial, and instead of rallying behind her, most residents began quietly distancing themselves, like she was a contagious disaster, because they finally realized she cared less about community and more about power. And I thought maybe that humiliation would finally force her to step back, but humiliation for someone like Karen does not end the fight, it mutates it, and by afternoon she was back pacing near her driveway, talking on her phone frantically with her voice shaking like she was trying to convince someone to join her mission, and failing miserably. And when she noticed me watching, she gave me the coldest stare, full of pure hatred but also fear, because she now understood she was losing her grip on everything she used to control, and she needed a new plan, something bigger, faster, and nastier. And that evening, while I was checking the weather forecast, I heard distant honking, then increasingly louder engines, and when I stepped outside I could not believe what I saw: a line of delivery trucks blocking the road, drivers stepping out confused, asking where to unload, and each one carried massive items ordered under my name: pallets of brick, portable toilets, stacks of lumber, even 2 giant bouncy castles, and they all demanded payment on delivery because the sender never paid, and every invoice listed the same buyer, HOA Karen. And when I confronted her, she screamed that she was merely improving my property with necessary upgrades and community fixtures, but the sheriff arrived once again and forced her to cancel every fraudulent delivery, while she argued louder and louder that she was only trying to help and it was not her fault. The world misunderstood her brilliance. Then, in the middle of her rant, another vehicle pulled up, this one marked county inspection, and the inspector stepped out with a clipboard saying he had received an anonymous complaint claiming I was building illegal structures and withholding permits, and I pointed out the news crews from the previous day had just filmed my property showing nothing but a gate and trees, and he nodded, annoyed that someone had wasted his time. And when he turned to leave, Karen began yelling at him, accusing him of corruption and favoritism, which earned her a report of her own for harassment of an official. By the end of that hour she had gained 2 new warnings from authorities and 1 furious neighborhood group chat asking her to resign from the HOA before she brought the entire association down with her. And that night I received a message from the HOA vice president asking to meet privately because they were considering removing Karen from the board entirely, and I could not help but smile because it seemed the walls of her empire were crumbling faster than she could tape them back together. But just when I thought she could not escalate further, she did something no one expected. She broke into tears, not the fake kind but real, frustrated, furious, desperate tears, slamming her front door behind her as she screamed that she had given this neighborhood her entire life and now everyone was betraying her. And for a brief moment I saw someone who was not a villain, just a deeply insecure person whose entire identity was built on rules and control. And now everything that made her feel important was slipping away, and that made her more dangerous than ever. The next day silence fell, a kind of eerie silence that made my instincts twitch, because Karen always announced her chaos loudly, so when she was quiet that meant she was planning something epic and bad. And at sunset I noticed her loading boxes into her car, and I wondered if she was finally leaving, but then she drove toward my gate instead, parking sideways to block the road, and she stepped out holding a large envelope, which she threw at my feet, shouting that she had filed a lawsuit against me personally, claiming emotional distress and community sabotage. And I opened the envelope expecting nonsense, and that is exactly what I got: a stack of poorly written accusations citing imaginary bylaws and meaningless legal jargon like unauthorized gate feelings and psychological obstruction of community peace. And I told her this would not hold up for a single second in court, which caused her face to contort with rage as she shrieked that I had destroyed her life, and she would not rest until my gate was torn off. And I apologized that she felt like the victim, but she refused to hear anything but her own narrative, and she stomped back to her car, slamming the door and speeding away like she was trying to outrun her own embarrassment. Minutes later my phone buzzed, my lawyer friend texting that he had seen the lawsuit paperwork already because Karen had filed it wrong and the clerk sent a copy to him automatically since my name was listed, and he said this was the weakest case he had ever read, and it might actually help me in any counter-action, and he also mentioned something casually that made everything click, that Karen had been fined heavily by the sheriff for false reports, tool misuse, and tampering with a law-linked security system, and she was also being pressured to repay HOA funds she had secretly used trying to enforce her vendetta, meaning she was not only humiliated, she was drowning in consequences, and in her mind I caused her ruin, and now she wanted revenge in the only way she had left Escalation without limits. As I stood in the dark watching my security feed glow from the screen, I realized that by cornering her with truth and law I had left her only with desperation, and a desperate Karen is more volatile than any power tool she ever tried to use on my gate, and I braced myself knowing Chapter 8 would not just be a conclusion, it would be the storm she had been building toward since the first moment she demanded my gate code, and now she would come for everything at once because she felt she had nothing left to lose, and that is when a person becomes the most unpredictable and the most dangerous. Karen's final move began not with drama but with eerie silence, the kind that creeps into your chest and warns you that the calm is just a disguise for a storm, and I noticed something strange. Right away her car was gone, her blinds were shut, and for the first time since I moved here her porch light was off, as if nobody lived there, and I should have felt relieved, but instead the hair on my neck stood up because Karen was not someone who simply gave up. When cornered she waited, she plotted, and she returned with fire in her veins, so I kept an eye on the security system, watching every motion alert, every heat signature across the boundary, knowing she would try to strike where she believed I was weakest, and that moment came late at night, when the first alarm pinged, detecting 3 figures moving along the fence line. No flashlight, no talking, just shadows creeping with slow precision, and for a moment my heart froze because this was no longer one woman's tantrum she had brought help. The feed zoomed automatically showing Karen and 2 men holding bolt cutters bigger than any tool she tried before, and they were whispering frantically as they searched for a blind spot, but there was none. I had cameras tucked into every tree, every angle, every approach, and the sheriff alert was 1 tap away, but something inside me told me to wait to see how far she would go before the law snapped shut around her neck, and she pointed toward the keypad, mouthing silent orders to the men, and they approached, snipping at the cable conduit, only to discover that it was reinforced with steel and tamper sensors, which immediately sent a silent notification to the sheriff dispatch along with video evidence, and Karen squinted at the keypad, as if staring at it would magically reveal the code she had obsessed over for months, and suddenly she lunged toward it, slamming her hand against the buttons with frantic desperation, and the first sharp beep echoed, the second beep flashed red, the third beep activated the full emergency alarm, and floodlights shot on, bathing the whole area in blinding white, and the men stumbled backward, shielding their eyes, while Karen screamed louder than the siren itself, and the system switched into recorded warning mode, announcing that law enforcement was en route and this property was under protected surveillance, and Karen panicked, yelling at the men to keep cutting, but they dropped the tools and bolted, running into the darkness, abandoning her right there, and she looked around wild-eyed, realizing she was alone again at the exact moment the sheriff vehicles came speeding down the road faster than ever, lights spraying red and blue across the night as deputies jumped out yelling commands, and Karen froze like a statue caught in headlights, too terrified to run, too stubborn to surrender, so she started ranting about how the community would suffer under my dictatorship, and she was the only one brave enough to save them, but her voice began cracking into sobs, and then she turned those desperate eyes toward me as I walked calmly out of my house, phone in hand, recording everything, not out of cruelty, but because everything needed to be documented now, and she shouted that I ruined her, that I humiliated her, that everything she had built was collapsing, and it was all my fault. She screamed that the HOA was supposed to follow her lead, but now they wanted her gone because of me, because I refused to kneel, and I let her rant because every word she spoke only buried her. deeper until the deputies finally approached her and placed her in handcuffs while reading her rights, and she kept screaming that she was protecting the community, she was restoring order, but her voice faded as reality suffocated her illusion of power. The next morning word spread fast: the HOA held an emergency vote and removed Karen from her position, permanently banning her from holding any HOA office for life, and the board knocked on my door not to fight but to apologize for the chaos she caused, admitting that she had acted alone using funds, resources, and authority they never approved, and they promised restitution and a full distancing from her actions, which I appreciated, even though part of me wondered how long they had let her run wild before taking responsibility. A week later, Karen's house went up for sale. Rumor was she was facing multiple charges, including property damage, trespassing, and harassment, and the fines alone were enough to drain her savings, so she had no choice but to leave. And on the day she moved out, she refused to look at me, but I watched from my porch as movers carried out box after box of rule books, trophies from HOA conventions, and stacks of complaint forms, probably the artifacts of the life she thought made her powerful. And as she climbed into the passenger seat of a friend's car, the doors slamming shut like a final act, she finally glanced my way just once, and I saw it: not anger, not revenge, not even hatred, but a hollow emptiness, like she was realizing that in her attempt to control everyone else she had lost control of herself. The car drove away without a word, without a goodbye, leaving behind only the fading echo of entitlement and the soft rustle of a chapter closing. Months passed, and peace returned, not just to my land, but to the entire neighborhood, and the HOA board actually improved, treating residents like people rather than pieces of a chessboard, and sometimes I would catch neighbors giving me silent nods of respect, grateful that someone had stood firm against a dictator disguised as a homeowner. And as for my gate, it remained untouched, strong, secure, and smarter than ever, still linked to the sheriff's station, still alert to trespassers, but rarely needing to activate because everyone now understood that boundary lines existed for a reason. And on quiet evenings, I would sit on my porch watching the sun paint the sky and sip my drink, knowing that there would always be people like Karen in the world, people who think power means owning others instead of owning themselves. But I also knew something even stronger: that as long as there are gates, laws, boundaries, and people willing to stand up for what is right, no Karen anywhere can ever truly win. And maybe one day she will learn what community actually means: not control or fear or authority, but respect, and that is something no gate code will ever unlock. And I smiled, thinking of all the chaos she caused, all the lessons learned, and I whispered to myself, not under the HOA, not then, not now, and never ever again.